Hey Justin, good morning.
Hey, how are you?
Oh, it's too hot. I know, how is it for you? I'm in Turkey. It is like by default, by definition, it is hot.
Yeah.
My body, I live in Sweden, and my body seems to have adjusted that temperature. So I'm suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, it's my office was like 28 C yesterday. Sitting in my office, I was like sweating. I was like, I'm over it. But I have a gaming computer in my office, and so I've turned that off, and I'm hoping that today it doesn't produce heat.
I have a small 4G modem, and it resets itself because of heat.
Yeah.
I never seen any modem resetting themselves. This was first for me. So if I disappear, it may be because of my modem.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so I'm in like this home improvement Slack channel at work, and there are people who are all excited about these like cameras that do heat sensing. It's like a thermal camera, and they use it for like detecting like HVAC leaks and stuff like that. But I've been really tempted to like buy or rent one just to like walk around my house in a hot day and be like, where's the heat leaking in? Catch it.
So I don't know if in Hamburg I can ping Terry so we can continue reiterating the idea around reference architecture if it makes sense to you. Let me see.
Yeah, for sure. I've been kind of playing around with something along those lines for work, which is we have like some Tecton stuff internally. And I'm like, I don't really understand. I don't have like lived experience with a lot of Kubernetes stuff. And so I was like putting together a little demo of an end-to-end deploy. And then also I'm trying to like figure out when I ask people to do things, like how long should it take? Like I don't have a good barometer for that right now. And so I'm like, oh, this seems really easy. Why does it take so long for us?
Yesterday I seen a tweet from someone, and that person said, oh, I was so angry that my employer started wiping out my clusters. But I am also so happy that they are doing it because I automate everything and everything happens so easily, quickly. So it's kind of, I think that may be a way to, get people simplify things, automate things, make them faster and so on. Because if people think like they will always have something up and running, they will not have a reason to think about those things.
Yeah.
So that was a fun thing to read. So I pinged Terry. He came back online. Let's see if he'll join. Oh, hi, Kara.
Hi, how are you all?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Super hot here, but
where are you?
Justin has device to measure.
Yeah, we were talking about having thermal cameras like around your house to see where the heat's coming in. Sure. Yeah, you can see it here in my background. I have Mylar bubble wrap that we put over the windows to kind of reflect the heat back out.
Oh, wow. That's intense. Where are you located?
Portland, Oregon.
Oh my God. Oh, because you don't have air conditioning. Okay, I get it.
We don't have air conditioning, and also like our house has a very large south-facing wall. And so that side of the house gets very hot.
Yeah. I mean, from the tips I'm reading, I have air conditioning here in Virginia, but like keeping track of what's happening in London where no one has air conditioning, And the tips I'm reading are like, close your blinds and, like put a nice thing in front of a fan and all this
Yep.
stuff.
Yep. There's a person on TikTok who specializes, his like PhD is, he's getting a PhD in basically heat science, like the anthropology of people surviving hot temperatures. And his like TikTok is full of like, okay, it's hot. Let's talk about what you should do. Like rinse your forearms. That's where a lot of blood vessels are and that sort of thing. It's pretty cool.
Oh, I should try
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. Cool.
So Terry said he will be with us shortly.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's like, because like when we were presenting the topic, I actually looked who is there, and I didn't see you, Justin. That's why I sent you the link to reference architecture deck, because like interoperability is key in such things, and I was like wondering your take on the topic, and now it looks like it's a good opportunity to continue talking about that, because next week this topic will be presented to the board as well. We already collected some feedback from the talk members during the meeting, but yeah, if we could work out on some more things, that would make things even better. Put the link to chat, please, if you don't have it handy. But did you have time to look at the deck, Justin, or?
I'm not sure that I did.
Okay.
But I don't recall. Let me just look through. I think I do. I think I did glance through this.
Yeah, I've been talking to a few people and I heard similar ideas from Terry and others, and it looks like it could be really beneficial for our community, different organizations, to have something like this in place, because even I am struggling sometimes to find out what is happening in which group and how those things could fit each other. And this could be a way to make them understandable in a more structured way and perhaps used for creating reference implementations based on what we could come up with. That was how it started, the discussion.
Yeah, and I'm building something like this internally, which amounts to a best practices thing, which is like, I have strong opinions about what a pipeline should look like. And so let me build a small one and like help you. You should do this.
I think that's what me and Terry discussed, is that like best practices is another key thing in this topic as well. So if you could put all these things together and present them in easily digestible manner, it would make others. By the way, what you just said reminded me the action item you had about the case study. So I'm not going to ask
for the mobile folks.
Yeah,
they said they're going to do it in August. There's someone out on sabbatical, and when he comes back, they're going to do it.
Okay, cool. So Terry joined us as well. So hi Terry. Yeah, we were talking like what we should be talking, and I said like, why not reference architecture? And like, because people seem to be interested, and we had some feedback from the technical side community folks. Maybe we can use this sometime from this meeting to work on some of those things. And maybe Justin missed the meeting on Tuesday. So Terry, if you want to summarize the discussion we had, you, me, and within the talk, that would make Justin's life better, perhaps. Or
I can also tell you what I think this is, and then you can correct me, and that might be make you not have to go through the whole presentation, right?
Sure.
So I think the thing that we're saying is that each SIG is kind of like a layer of concern when it comes to a CD pipeline. So like supply chain has their own, like, here are the 10 things that you should probably be doing. And we're going to amalgamate that into a reference architecture and say, like, here's the Tecton version of the reference architecture, and here's the Kepton version, Argo CD, etc. That's what I think we're talking about.
Yeah, so that's certainly a part of what we're thinking about here. I mean, the big picture is that what we've had to date has been a very bottom-up open source approach, in that, you know, we've had a lot of projects focused on very specific issues within that continuous delivery space. And then we've had some overarching projects like best practices that have been, you know, looking at the methodology itself. But what we're lacking right now is joining all those bits together in a way that makes it easier for people to actually access all this knowledge and make use of it efficiently and effectively. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it certainly as part of the best practices work, it's become really clear from interviewing people that there are two really strong camps. There's those who are already heavily involved in continuous delivery, who you know, are really committed to the whole thing. It's a core part of their business culture, and you know, in many cases they're already heavily involved with us in working on various projects to solve particular technical problems. And then you've got the rest of the world who have only the loosest grasp of what continuous delivery actually means, and in many cases are really struggling to understand how they can get any value from it, or how they can get from where they are to where they need to be within the, you know, constraints that are upon them. So, you know, we've really saturated the market in terms of our engagement with those groups who are already very familiar with continuous delivery. And if we want to take the foundation further, we really now need to start opening the doors to, you know, all the rest of the world who stand to really benefit from being able to adopt those methodologies, but are struggling because of the massive barriers to entry in terms of, you know, the knowledge gap and the technology gap and everything else. So the idea with this piece of work was to do a couple of things, really. One was to just really spell out the patterns so that we could go from, you know, that higher level methodology view that we've been doing in best practices to, here are the architectural patterns that you're going to need to manage within your organization, which then opens up the opportunity for all the projects to then say, you know, and here's how we implement those architectural patterns with our project. So that allows the projects, and it also allows the members to get more involved in promoting ways of solving these patterns using the tools that are available today. But it also allows us to have the bigger conversation, which is, how do we work more closely with, you know, for example, cloud vendors who are members, who want to improve their capability so as to be able to offer that as a service to their customers, and how can we help them to do that in a, you know, a standardized way that's implementing best practice, and therefore, you know, making it easier for the projects to integrate and come together into supported offerings within cloud vendors that are accessible to the rest of the world in terms of the software availability.
So where are you in the process? Like, this is like idea stage, or we have like feelings and like strong opinions about what the reference architecture is, or?
So at this stage, we're just talking to everyone to get a feel for people's reaction to this as a piece of work. You know, is this something that's broadly supported within the foundation? Does everybody agree that this is a good next step? And you know, we got some strong opinions from the TOC meeting, and there was quite a lot of excitement. So certainly worth having that conversation with the governing board to gauge reaction there. But I think it makes a lot of sense to do something structured to try and pull all these pieces together. Because right now we've got some very valuable assets. You know, CD events is a really important piece of work. Best practices has been a very useful piece of work, and we've also got things like the MLOps roadmap, which is going to prove very important over the next few years, but which is currently still in a blind spot for most people in the continuous delivery space. So right now, none of those assets are really being effectively utilized because we've got a focus at the moment, which is on the detailed technology stack. And so most people are heavily contributing to the individual projects and are focused on solving one problem. But what we haven't yet been able to do is really connect everyone together to see the bigger picture of what does the future of continuous delivery actually look like, and what capabilities do consumers of that technology need over the next 5 to 10 years to make this stuff actually useful and add value broadly across the industry. And I think we're in a position now to start having those conversations. And I think if we do, that will bring in a new audience into the foundation. You know, where we've been addressing a very technical development audience to date, I think there's an opportunity to now reach out more into that product manager area, where what you're saying is, okay, here's a chance to influence the capability that you rely on to produce your products, and to do that in a way that becomes more standardized, with more reuse, with more interchangeability, so that in the future you'll have a much bigger pool of potential technologies that you can select from, and it'll be easier for you to switch potentially across platforms or between vendors as a result.
Just to continue on that, it's one of the reasons that we really believe that interoperability is important to really emphasize in the reference architecture. When we're speaking to maybe not the developers, like, I think it's quite easy for people to get wrapped up in a certain stack and sort of get buy-in and maybe a certain line of technologies and a certain product. And it's really important that we have it very clear in this reference architecture that interoperability is both important from any sort of maintenance perspective, but also really possible and doable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I've been doing I mentioned this, I think, Terry, before you joined, but I've been doing something along these lines internally at eBay. And I have this notion in my head about what a pipeline should look like to hit the business goals that we have around like what quality looks like and when we deploy and what pieces should go where. And I've been building out a kind of toy example of like, here's a thing that deploys to a staging, etc. And so it was very timely to see this show up. I'm like, oh yeah, great. I'm building a version of this already. So it'd be interesting to compare notes to see how the thing that I built is different than the thing that other people view as their reference.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really important as we start to move into a future where every single product has got some machine learning component to it. Because right now, ML ops is still diverging away from continuous delivery. And so the tooling that's available in that space is almost entirely incompatible with this methodology. So it'd be really good to start making those challenges clearer to a bigger audience and starting to get the projects and the tool vendors who are already in the continuous delivery space to start thinking about the requirements of those machine learning assets. Because if we don't join those two things up, there's going to be a big crunch probably in a year's time, where the fundamental challenges in that space run up against the regulatory challenges that are coming, and it all hits a wall because the way in which those MLOps tools operate skirts around most of the governance processes that we're used to having for our conventional assets. And so it's going to be very hard to operate in a highly regulated environment when your tools don't support the kind of quality controls that we're used to with our CD processes.
That makes sense. So I'm going to assume, having not been to one of these yet, that the board meeting will result in people being excited because this is an exciting thing. How can folks who are interested in kind of the interoperability side of the world pitch in? Like, what is the mechanisms of involvement that you're looking for the next steps?
So from my perspective, what I'd like to see us doing is capturing the patterns that are involved. So to look at this from the perspective of best practices. So saying, here's the overarching end-to-end methodology, but what architectural patterns are involved when you start to try and implement that as a set of systems and processes. So it would be good to get people involved from that perspective of taking a step back from the engineering piece, and saying, if we go upwards from CD events, what's in that gap between here's a standard for how you talk about a pipeline, but then how does that fit into the bigger picture of we have multiple product teams working on different aspects of multiple product lines. We're trying to tie all that together into a managed set of assets that we can update at a very rapid cadence. And I think that's going to be interesting because it's going to allow people to come into contact with things that not everybody has had experience of. Because everyone will have had experience of working within a project team on a set of features with continuous delivery pipelines, but not everyone will have had the perspective of what happens when you look at this from a product perspective, where the actual asset that you want to manage isn't just one feature set, it's the entire pipeline of product across multiple product lines. And you're trying to think about how you can keep all of that moving, but also control the quality and the maintainability of the stack at that level.
Yeah, if your question was more around like logistic stuff, Justin, I know, like how people can find what discussion to join around this topic. I think that is one of the things that needs to be worked out probably during next talk meeting on August 2nd. So the plan is like, let me open that slide and start sharing, because this is so new discussion. We didn't want to prescribe how to work with this. So the plan was like present this to TOC, which we did on Tuesday. And then next week's discussion will be interesting and important. And then, yeah, okay. Discuss the way forward within CDF TOC. So August 2nd. And depending on the feedback, it could go maybe under SIG best practices or any work group that sits across different groups, taking input from all these different, initiatives. And like how we do with SIGs, work groups are similar. Anyone can join, It's like, that is the way, at least I was thinking, but obviously we need to hear the feedback from governing board next week and then discuss this again during TOC meeting to see what people think about how best we can push this forward. So as the question you asked very early, like, is this idea, it is still idea phase, like, can we work on this? What is the interest? What is the support? Is this the right thing to do? And that's my feeling, like we have interest in this, and what Terry explained makes a lot of sense to me personally. So assuming this happens, then the rest is details, like we just come together and start working on this in whatever way commit things to work.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. There's been some things that we've done in SIG interoperability around what's the problem space, maybe how I would say that. Like when we want to have a quality gate for, like, is this good enough to promote to the next stage of our pipeline? What are the options? Like what can people even do there? Like, one is just run tests, but like, what kind of tests? Is it conformance tests? Is it performance tests, etc.? And so that we've been, some of that work is stuff we've done, but there's certainly a need for a lot more. One of the things that I've been thinking about since we've been talking is it seems, I'm curious what it might look like to have a way for companies or organizations or people to say, here's what I think, or here's what our pipeline actually looks like. Like, here's our little pipeline diagram that we made. And then kind of compare and contrast those. I think that would be an interesting, experiment in the same vein as this.
That
So-
is actually, yeah, go ahead, Terry.
I was just going to say, have either of you encountered the TOGAF architectural framework?
I did quite some time ago, but it's
So TOGAF is the architecture group open framework, and what it is basically a very complicated checklist of all the things that you might encounter when you're trying to build an enterprise system. So it's a way of approaching the management of a very complex system or a complex suite of systems by always using the same way of working to investigate and document what you're dealing with, so that there's a set of standard ways of looking at the problem, and then you can use that as an easy way to communicate between architects and vendors and development teams, because you've got some standard documentation. Now, one of the key tools within that is a thing called views and viewpoints. And what this does really is, if you've got a complex business situation that's like a giant ball of knotted string, it's very complicated to try and understand that and explain it to people so that you can decompose it into solutions. So what you do is you say that there are going to be multiple stakeholders involved in this problem, and each stakeholder is going to have a view on their part of the problem, and that view is held from a particular viewpoint. So these are like slices across the ball of string that you can say that, as a product manager, you're going to be looking at a problem from a particular perspective, whereas a sales manager or somebody in marketing is going to have a very different view on the same problem. And what you do is you build your architecture by capturing every view and viewpoint, documenting them, and making sure that your solution synthesizes all of those views into a coherent solution. So you'll have seen this page in best practices, which has got a series of stories on it, and these are very crude, high level views from given viewpoints within stakeholders in a product. So a good way to approach this challenge is actually to take what we've got here and then expand that out to the next level of detail, which is to say, when we're talking about continuous delivery as a methodology, who are the stakeholders in the typical organization? What views do they hold? And what do they need from a continuous delivery process? and then that allows you to come at the the challenges that we were just discussing about, what do you need in a quality gate? Well, if you look at that from each of the viewpoints of each of the stakeholders within the customer organization, it then becomes more clear, because each viewpoint will have its own idea of what a quality check is at that level. And you'll then find that actually you've got multiple different aspects that need to be verified, and some of those things will be engineering concepts like security tests and things like that, but others will be marketing quality, like, does this adhere to our brand values and our design map, are the colors right, those types of things. So by breaking it up that way, you can fairly quickly get to a top-down view on which factors need to be included in any automation process in order to make that most useful to a given organization. And it'll start to show up gaps in the existing tooling, because some things are easy to do with existing tools, and like testing, and other things are really hard to do, like a lot of the things in the software supply chain space are now starting to overlap into this area, as we begin to understand that software supply chain is not just supply chain security. It's all the other aspects of that supply chain around licensing and availability of libraries, and reliability and maintenance, and in some cases commercial contracts between different suppliers. So there's a lot there, but I think we can tease a lot of it out into quite simple threads. So what we're going to end up with is a little bit like the best practices site, where we decompose the problem into a handful of views. We'll have lots of short, simple views with simple maps of, from this perspective, these things are important, and here is the point in the process where you should be automating and validating these checks. And so that'll give you the top-down view. But then we also want the community space for people to then be able to say, okay, and here's how our project fits into that. And here are some examples of how you solve this piece and this piece using our tool. Does that make sense?
Off mute. Yeah, I think it does. I think that there's the community piece of that you mentioned, which is like the technical community of the CDF, who's like, okay, you want to use Tecton. Tecton solves these 7 problems. And then there's the community space of companies who have CD pipelines, who I think it would be useful for them to be able to share their view on it. And I think that would be an interesting, if nothing else, an interesting discussion point, and it would raise the profile of different players in that world, I think. So if you can see the what does this random startups pipeline look like as compared to Amazon? Right, like there's going to certainly be more policies in place and more quality gates in one versus the other. And I think it would, if we compare and contrast different implementations, like real life implementations, I bet it would bring up really interesting points of discussion.
Yeah. And I think one of the areas of real value in this is in starting to flag areas where there's actually no good solution. I keep coming back to MLOps in this space, but it's just a really obvious example of this. You know, a very well-respected MLOps tool chain would be something like SageMaker, which has a massive variety of capabilities in the machine learning space, and even has some things that it calls CI/CD pipelines. But the whole end-to-end process exists in isolation. So you can build all of your machine learning assets with that tool chain, but those machine learning assets probably only represent about 5% of your actual product assets when you're trying to, you know, actually go into production with that product. And so you end up in a situation where you've got one group of people building the product and another group of people building the machine learning, and they're not operating in a unified methodology with a standard set of tools. They're operating to very different models using very different tools. And therefore, how do you perform the right level of governance over those product releases when at some point somebody's chucking something over the fence to somebody else and the two governance methodologies just don't interconnect?
For folks that are less up to speed on ML ops world, is there a good overview?
So the ML ops roadmap, which is one of our SIG groups, actually gives you a good overview and then a detailed breakdown of all the challenges that exist in that space at the moment. So it's worth scanning over that if you want to understand how MLOps is effectively an extension of DevOps for machine learning assets, but also how the term MLOps has been taken by a number of tool vendors and twisted to mean something completely different.
Where is that roadmap?
So if you dive into the CD Foundation repos in GitHub, you'll find there's a SIG MLOps one.
Yep. Oh, this
yep.
roadmap.
And if you drill down roadmap and 2021 and that one.
Got it. Cool. So yeah, I'll give that a look.
Some bedtime reading for you. And we're just about to kick off the update for this year. So if you're interested in getting involved in that, then give me a shout.
Awesome.
So one more thing, Terry, about the next week's discussion. I needed to rework the deck to make them less text and more, instead of people reading the text. I will share those slides with you. I think now it is 4 slides instead of 8. I need to combine a few of them, and then you can take a look at them, and then I can update them if you have any comments. So and it will be
if we're taking the text out, is there a notes section that you can stick it in so that it's just there as a reminder?
Yeah, I put the original text you put on customer problems and getting to customer, those 2 slides to speaker notes, and just left the mentoring part and other thing, what was adoption part, those sentences are on the slide, and the rest bullet points are on speaker notes. But I will share the deck, those slides with you so you can see.
Yeah, it's always a trade-off between, not having a deck that's just a bunch of stuff that you're reading from versus having a deck that people who weren't in the meeting can actually read and understand when they're trying to catch up.
Yeah. So I was just saying something I remembered. Justin, you said so people could compare and contrast the pipelines they have. I think I see this work kind of relate to case studies as well, in a way, if you see it that way. Like, as we've been talking, like when we have your case study, we will then, like, we already start talking a few others as well. We can then have like knowledge base or whatever based on the case studies we are getting from different organizations. That would also help the work we will be doing with reference architecture, because then we'll be able to see who is doing what, perhaps why, and could perhaps try to address some of these things within reference architecture as well. And I expect there will be lots of overlaps on approaches. Tools might be different, but approaches would be pretty similar to each other, I think.
Yeah, I'm like, the thing that keeps popping up in my head is, if you were to draw a pipeline on a whiteboard, you'd end up with a bunch of boxes in a row, and then like some boxes under it run what the approvals are before you move to the next box, things like that. And if there was a way where you could say, like, I want to see what the Amazon version of that is, the Google version of that. Okay, what, like, let's put both on the same view. Like, what do those, how do they compare and contrast with one another? Like, if we had common words and languages, which I think we do, around these different stages and quality gates, then that provides us the ability to provide layers, like visual layers of, all right, here's what the pipeline that everyone seems to have looks like, or an approximation of these 3 companies. They have these pieces in common, and here's where they're different. And being able to visualize that would be really interesting.
Yeah, I think we went through a similar exercise 3 years ago when we first started Interop. That's Rosetta Stone or vocabulary thing. That's how we end up creating that, because like people were using Jenkins, Zool, or GitHub Actions, I don't know when it was created, but anyway, you get the point. We said, like, what that thing maps to what other thing in this. So now if this, the reference architecture could be a higher look of that thing, because that document goes into details. So if you could take a higher level view of the pipelines, then that would make things better to understand, because then those different quality gates, stages or steps or whatever could be seen in typical pipeline way.
No, I think the interesting thing here is that people are going to discover that very few organizations have simple linear pipelines, and that in many cases it's a very complex, multi-iterative, event-driven process that is almost impossible to diagram, because you've got things coming in at you from various different directions at different cadences, and at some point somebody's trying to reconcile all of that and make a release out of it. So yeah, that's
it's interesting because that's not my experience, and so I'd love to hear more about. Maybe you could say more about what you mean there.
So the probably some good examples of that are going to come out of the supply chain work, because I think we've already had a couple of discussions where we've tried to break that down into a simple linear hierarchy and identified that no, actually it doesn't look like that, because once you go beyond the scope of a single work stream, so if you've got a product team working on a single feature or a single customer set of features within a product, they can think about things relatively linearly in that space.
Yeah.
But when your scale is big enough that you have multiple dependencies, and there's visibility of all the teams who are working on stuff that actually contributes to this, suddenly you get to see that it's pipelines all the way down, but they're all working at different paces, and therefore things are shifting underneath you in an unknown and uncontrollable way, and you're trying to slide your deliveries against all these other deliveries to get things to sync up at points where you've got, it's almost like an eventual consistency problem that you have to reconcile things and pin them at points in time, and then they drift apart again. And once you start to look at the whole software supply chain, and you're going from your application stack down through all your direct library dependencies to operating system dependencies and down into the physical hardware in the machine, then suddenly you get to see the whole picture of just how much complexity there is that has to be reconciled to get anything that's actually reliable in a known state. And this is where people like Apple are much better at managing this stuff, because they have processes to control all aspects of the supply chain, and therefore they can synchronize more of these things up. But at the same time, they're also the least likely to want to talk about it. So it's hard to get access to that massive pool of knowledge in that space.
Awesome. All right. Well, I don't think I have any more questions, and we're kind of nearing time. Karafati, do you have any?
No.
I'm just wondering, just following on again from what Terry was saying about how certain companies might be more private on what their pipelines look like. Do you foresee that as an issue as we try and solicit or ask companies to, like, do you find that to be a problem for eBay? You have this internal sort of reference architecture that you're building out. Do you think it will be at all an issue to share that publicly, or do you think it will be an issue for other companies to do so?
I think from my perspective, at least, like, I would be fine to share eBay's pipeline shape. There's nothing super secret to say things like, yeah, we make sure that translations exist and the tests pass. And
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's
to
good
an
to know.
extent, there's quite a lot of sort of opportunity for virtue signaling in sharing this, because you can get to make public all of the hard work that's going into validating what you're doing, and your quality controls and gateways and everything else. And to an extent, Apple have started to make more of that information public at a higher level. So, for example, they're always providing details about their renewables and your reuse work, stuff like that. So I think it's one of those things where, like discussing your salary, once it passes a threshold where it's considered socially acceptable, then suddenly it becomes the norm and everyone's talking about it. And so, if we can help to encourage people to brag about their activities in this space and provide a forum for sharing that information, then that's actually good for everybody, because you get to engage people in a better conversation. And I think there is a real need for us to introduce that kind of peer pressure, because I see frightening examples of very, very low standards in producing commercial software on a regular basis, and people still believe it's acceptable for them to ship code in such a poor way because they're not seeing any peer pressure on them to do any better.
all right, well, I think that's about our time for the day. Thanks again, Terry, for coming by to chat about this reference architecture stuff. It's really interesting.
My pleasure.
Cool.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm gonna drop. Everyone have a good rest of your day.
So,
Speak to you soon.
thank you.
Thanks, Sam.
Thanks.